Welcome to our channel HASHMICLINICS.
Welcome, everyone, and a very specific welcome to you.
Yes, to the listener who provided this incredible stack of source material we're looking at today.
Exactly. We have a custom-tailored deep dive ready for you. We are focusing on a highly specific and historically really fascinating mineral compound.
Ammonium Phosphoricum.
Right, which is traditionally known as phosphate of ammonia. And when I was reviewing the clinical notes and those historical materia medica excerpts you sent over, what immediately stands out is just the sheer density of the observation.
Oh, absolutely.
You provided these practitioner notes from Professors Dr. Rifat Hashmi, alongside these foundational texts from, late 19th and early 20th century clinical heavyweight.
People like Boerk and Clark.
Yeah, Boerk and Clark. It provides this fascinating window into how early medical practitioners mapped a single chemical to a very, very rigid set of human ailments.
It's a remarkable collection of data, really. I mean, Boerk and Clark were essentially the great synthesizers of their era. They were out there collecting thousands of clinical observations, and they were attempting to find the exact physiological patterns that these substances either produced or alleviated.
And having their historical baseline cross-referenced with modern notes, like the ones from Dr. Hashmi, it gives us this rare multi-generational view.
Exactly. We are looking at over a century of empirical data focused on the exact same molecular structure.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we get into the systemic effects this compound has on the human body, we should really establish the physical and chemical baseline.
That's a good place to start.
The historical descriptions in your sources are remarkably sensory. Like, they describe the formation of these large, colorless, transparent crystals. And they actually make a point to note its cooling, saline taste, which is just a good reminder of how these early chemists and clinicians interacted with their materials.
Yeah, they were very hands-on.
Right. They weren't just, running mass spectrometry. They were utilizing their own senses to categorize the pharmacological profile of the salts they were working with.
They had to. That sensory engagement was a primary diagnostic tool for the chemicals themselves.
Right.
From a purely chemical standpoint, ammonium phosphoricum is firmly rooted in the mineral kingdom, specifically within the ammonia group. The literature you provided uses the precise term hydrodiammonic phosphate.
Hydrodiammonic phosphate. Got it.
Exactly. When we look at its fundamental architecture, we are dealing with a specific synthesis of hydrogen, nitrogen, and phosphorus.
So it's a pretty complex structure.
It is a heavy, structurally complex salt. And understanding that elemental makeup is totally crucial when we start looking at how it behaves once it actually enters the human bloodstream.
Which brings us to the preparation methods detailed in the sources, because that is where the pharmacology gets incredibly interesting.
The trituration process.
Yes, trituration. The notes discuss taking those large transparent crystals and mechanically grinding them down with a biologically inert base.
Specifically sugar of milk.
Right, sugar of milk. But it isn't just about making the medicine easier to swallow, is it?
Not at all.
It's fundamentally about altering the bioavailability of the mineral.
Exactly. That is the core pharmacological theory at play here.
By subjecting the pure chemical to that extreme mechanical friction, they were breaking the crystalline structure down to a micro level, right? So it could interface with human tissue differently than just a raw, crude dose.
Yes. Trituration increases the surface area of the substance exponentially.
Okay.
You're taking a dense inorganic crystal and rendering it into a state where cellular absorption becomes highly efficient.
And your sources highlight a really fascinating dichotomy in how this was administered back then.
They really do.
Because you have the raw allopathic dosage listed as 10 to 30 grains dissolved in water.
Which is a substantial pharmacologically aggressive dose.
Right, it's huge. But then you have the standard historical homeopathic preparation, which is listed as the third decimal trituration, or 3x.
Meaning it has gone through that rigorous mechanical grinding and dilution process 3 times over.
It's a massive paradigm shift in dosing logic.
It really is.
You go from a heavy material dose of up to 30 grains, which is intended to force a biochemical reaction, to this highly refined, minute dose designed to trigger a much more subtle physiological response.
But what's amazing is the clinical consensus.
Exactly. Regardless of whether they were using the heavy grain doses or that 3x trituration, all the clinical notes, from Hashmi to Clark to Boerk, they all converge on one undeniable primary target in the human body:
The joints.
chronic gout and severe afflictions of the joints.
The structural joints are the absolute epicenter of this compound's clinical profile.
But they really are.
The literature consistently revolves around the phrase uric acid diathesis.
So for you listening, to contextualize that within 19th century medical thought, a diathesis wasn't just a localized disease, right?
Right. It was a constitutional predisposition.
A systemic underlying vulnerability in the patient's entire metabolic process.
In this specific case, they are describing a body that is fundamentally incapable of properly metabolizing and excreting uric acid.
Which leads to a chronic systemic accumulation.
Exactly.
And the physical manifestation of that accumulation is where the sources get hyper-specific. I mean, they aren't just noting generalized joint pain or stiffness.
No, they document distinct, palpable deformities,
The clinical term they use is nodosities.
which they clearly identify as concretions of urate of soda.
Right. Think of it like hard mineral deposits building up inside an old plumbing system. But this calcification is happening right under the skin, specifically on the joints.
And the texts isolate the finger joints and the backs of the hands as the primary sites for these formations.
That structural deformation is such a crucial marker in these notes.
It is. When urate of soda crystallizes in the synovial fluid and the surrounding tissues, it creates these hard, visible nodules called tophi.
Tophi.
Yes, it physically alters the anatomy of the hands. It renders them stiff, inflamed, and often severely crippled.
But while the fingers and hands are definitely the primary keynotes, the sources do map this diathesis across the broader skeletal system too.
They do. They detail its application in chronic arthritis, as well as arthritis deformans.
And arthritis deformans indicates a severe, progressive reshaping and destruction of the joint architecture, correct?
Exactly. They also point to synovitis, which is the inflammation of the synovial membrane lining the joints.
Along with specific gouty afflictions of the larger hinges, like the hip and shoulder joints.
Right. The picture it paints is of a patient whose entire structural framework is under siege by their own metabolic byproduct.
It's a deep, chronic, inflammatory state. And if the notes stopped right there, we would simply classify Ammonium Phosphoricum as a highly specialized rheumatological agent.
But they don't stop there.
No, they don't. Here's where it gets really interesting.
The respiratory connection.
Yes, the sources pivot from these strictly mechanical, joint-based deformities to a secondary set of symptoms that seem, at first glance, entirely unrelated.
It's a fascinating leap.
The texts draw a direct, undeniable line between the calcified joints and the respiratory system.
And this is where we see the brilliance of their systemic observation. The sources explicitly note that ammonium phosphoricum is highly effective for chronic bronchitis.
But they add a vital, qualifying detail.
Right. It is effective for chronic bronchitis, specifically in gouty subjects.
In gouty subjects, that is such a huge distinction.
They were not treating the lungs and the joints as two separate, isolated systems.
No, they recognized that the chronic respiratory distress was a secondary manifestation of the exact same underlying metabolic dysfunction.
That correlation is brilliant.
It really is. It shows they understood systemic inflammation long before we had the modern biological terminology to describe it.
Exactly. If you have the urate concretions on your hands, your chronic cough is part of the same physiological mechanism.
And the respiratory symptoms they document are heavy and oppressive. They aren't talking about a light tickle in the throat.
No, they describe a deep, rough cough.
A deep, rough cough that is accompanied by a very specific grayish-green or greenish expectoration.
Furthermore, that rough cough and greenish mucus are paired with a profound feeling of tightness or constriction around the chest.
So the patient feels physically restricted, not just in their joints, but in their actual pulmonary capacity.
The inflammation has essentially migrated or generalized. It creates a heavy, stagnant respiratory picture that perfectly mirrors the heavy, stagnant mineral deposits in the hands.
It's all connected by this overriding theme of heaviness and restriction.
It really is a cohesive picture.
And as you dig deeper into the notes you provided, you find these incredibly niche modalities that clinicians relied on to confirm this specific constitutional profile.
The timing of the symptoms, for instance.
Yes, they were tracking physiological clues that most modern intake forms would completely ignore today.
Oh, absolutely.
For example, the sources detail a patient experiencing excessive sneezing, accompanied by a heavy discharge from the nose and eyes.
Which sounds like a standard allergy.
Right. But the crucial detail is the timing. It occurs only in the morning.
What's fascinating here is the reliance on chronology as a diagnostic tool.
I love that aspect of it.
The exact time of day a symptom aggregates or diminishes was considered a vital clue to the body's internal rhythms.
It told them how the underlying diathesis was expressing itself throughout the day.
It's abjectly.
And they applied that same microscopic observation to the patient's excretions. I mean, in a gout remedy, you expect them to monitor the urine for uric acid crystals.
Right.
But the description is highly specific. They're looking for a distinct rose-colored or pinkish-red sediment left behind in the basin.
Not just any sediment, rose-colored.
Yes. And they also highlight a profound environmental sensitivity.
The chilliness.
An intense feeling of chilliness or coldness triggered by the absolute least draft of air.
If we connect all of this to the bigger picture, it demonstrates an incredibly cohesive medical philosophy.
How so?
Well, today, a patient with these symptoms might be fragmented across several specialists.
Oh, for sure. You'd see a rheumatologist for the hands.
A pulmonologist for the bronchitis.
Maybe an allergist for the morning sneezing.
Exactly. But these historical practitioners synthesized all of it.
They look at the whole board.
The structural deformities, the green expectoration, the morning-specific histamine response, the rose-colored sediment, and the extreme thermal sensitivity to a draft.
All of these were viewed as a single, unified expression of the Ammonium Phosphoricum constitution.
It is a phenomenal example of pattern recognition in medicine.
It really is.
Yeah.
Now, shifting gears slightly, I want to examine the most dramatic narrative included in your stack of sources.
The Voigt experiment.
Yes. Buried right there in the clinical data is the C-Voigt experiment, which is a direct proving of the substance on a healthy human subject.
It is quite a story.
And honestly, reading through Voigt's timeline, the physiological math of it is quite puzzling.
The proving provides a vital window into the acute toxicity of the compound.
Right, which contrasts sharply with its use in chronic, slow-moving conditions like gout.
Very sharply.
Because look at the dosage. The text states that C-Voigt took exactly 3 grains of ammonium phosphoricum.
3 grains.
Earlier, we established that the standard raw clinical dose could range anywhere from 10 to 30 grains.
Yes.
Yet taking only 3 grains, Voigt experiences a massive physiological cascade within a single hour.
It doesn't track as a simple, straightforward overdose.
No, it doesn't. It reads like a profound idiosyncratic shock to his system.
It definitely suggests an acute, hyperreactive physiological response.
Walk us through what happened to him.
According to the timeline in the notes, the reaction began with a sudden, severe tightness in the precordia.
And just to clarify, the precordia is the region of the thorax immediately situated over the heart.
Right. So this wasn't the slow, chronic chest restriction of the bronchitis patient.
This was an acute cardiac and respiratory seizing.
Exactly. And this precordial tightness was rapidly followed by severe nausea and unquenchable thirst.
And then his cardiovascular system essentially redlines.
It does.
The notes describe his pulse becoming hard, small, and highly frequent. His body is frantically trying to compensate for whatever systemic shock the compound has initiated.
Culminating in what the text ominously refers to as a collapsed state of the circulation.
A collapsed state of the circulation. To go from 3 grains of a mineral salt to circulatory collapse in an hour demonstrates an intense, rapid onset interaction with the central nervous system and the heart.
The sheer speed of the circulatory collapse is alarming.
Very.
But the aftermath of that acute phase is perhaps even more critical for our understanding of the compound's clinical profile.
What happened after?
Well, once Voigt survived the circulatory failure, he documented a profound fullness and tension in his head.
Okay.
But more importantly, he experienced an extreme, debilitating heaviness in his limbs.
There's that heaviness again.
Yes, and this heaviness forced him into a distinctly unsteady, tottering gait.
So he physically lost the ability to coordinate his lower limbs effectively.
Right, a tottering gait and heavy limbs. His motor function was deeply compromised.
And this brings us to a highly unexpected application documented in the text.
The neurological connection.
Yes. We have established its role in treating structural joints and its secondary role in the respiratory system. But the Voigt experiment points directly to the nervous system.
It does.
And the clinical notes corroborate this by explicitly stating that a practitioner named Allen successfully utilized this exact salt in cases of facial paralysis.
Which raises an important question regarding the full pharmacological scope of ammonium phosphoricum.
How does facial paralysis fit into this?
Well, facial paralysis implies a direct interference with the cranial nerves, specifically the 7th cranial nerve.
Okay.
When you combine Allen's clinical success in treating facial paralysis with Voigt's acute proving symptoms...
The heavy limbs, the loss of motor coordination, the tottering gait.
Exactly. It suggests that this compound acts as a profound depressant on nerve pathways and motor function.
It fundamentally changes how you view the remedy.
It really does.
It isn't just depositing urate crystals in the synovial fluid. It is interacting heavily with the neurological wiring that controls those muscles and joints.
You start by picturing a patient with swollen, calcified finger joints.
Right.
And by synthesizing all these notes, you end up with a portrait of a patient who might also suffer from facial paralysis.
A patient who cannot walk without tottering due to limb heaviness.
Who shivers violently at a slight draft of air.
And who carries a deep, constricting, rough cough.
It is an incredibly dense, multi-dimensional profile of systemic failure.
It perfectly illustrates the depth of observation required to build these historical materia medicas.
They were documenting the intersection of metabolic dysfunction, respiratory distress, and neurological depression.
And meticulously linking them all back to a single chemical trigger.
It's astounding.
So what does this all mean? For you, the listener who compiled these sources, what is the ultimate takeaway from this deep dive? Why does a 19th century profile of phosphate of ammonia matter in a modern context?
The most profound takeaway is the realization that these late 19th and early 20th century practitioners were identifying complex systemic inflammatory pathways decades before we had the biological terminology or the imaging technology to fully explain them.
They were so far ahead of their time.
They were. Modern medicine is only just recently shifting back toward this holistic view.
Right, because we now have extensive clinical data proving that chronic gout and high uric acid levels are intrinsically linked to severe cardiovascular disease.
And to respiratory inflammation.
And even neurological decline.
Exactly. The historical notes from Hashmi, Boric, and Clark weren't just listing random coincidences.
They were accurately mapping a systemic inflammatory cascade.
Reviewing these sources is a vital reminder that the body does not operate in isolated silos.
It really reinforces the value of hyperspecific observation, doesn't it?
It does. It shows the importance of looking at the entire physiological board.
I think that is an incredibly powerful insight. They were tracking the exact same systemic pathways we study today. They were just using a different vocabulary and relying purely on their own meticulous observation.
Beautifully said.
Now, before we conclude this analysis, there is one final lingering detail from your stack of sources that I want to leave you, the listener, to ponder.
This is a great detail.
It's a detail we didn't weave into the main clinical breakdown because it sits entirely outside the realm of standard physiology.
Right.
Buried right in the middle of the clinical symptom lists, standing completely alone without any further explanation, is a single word: Saturn.
It is a highly deliberate and striking inclusion in an otherwise strictly clinical text.
It really is. And we invite you to explore the implications of that inclusion.
Because in the traditions of ancient philosophy, alchemy, and medical astrology, the planetary body of Saturn has very specific associations.
Right. It is the planet traditionally linked to extreme heaviness,
To the metal lead.
to deep, penetrating coldness.
Then to chronic, slow-moving degenerative afflictions of the skeletal system and the joints.
Characteristics which perfectly mirror the heavy limbs, the intense sensitivity to cold drafts, the depressed motor function, and the chronic calcifying joint deformities we've just spent this entire deep dive discussing.
It really is a perfect mirror.
It serves as this fascinating hidden bridge between ancient esoteric philosophy and empirical 19th century clinical observation.
It makes you wonder why a practitioner felt compelled to write Saturn next to the profile of Ammonium Phosphoricum.
Was it just a shorthand for the systemic heaviness and coldness? Or were they drawing a deeper alchemical connection?
It is a brilliant historical mystery.
And one that we will leave entirely in your hands to investigate next. Thank you so much for sharing this exceptional stack of notes with us. We thoroughly enjoyed analyzing this material with you, and we hope this deep dive provided some valuable new perspectives on the history and depth of medical observation. Until next time, keep looking closely at the details.
Professor Dr. Rafat Hashmi is a distinguished homeopathic physician, educator, and researcher with over 4 decades of clinical and teaching experience. He is widely respected for his deep command of materia medica, repertory, and constitutional prescribing, combined with a practical, patient-centered approach. Dr. Hashmi has dedicated his career to training generations of homeopathic doctors, blending classical principles with modern clinical insight. He is also known for his innovative work in digital homeopathy, developing educational content, clinical tools, and AI-assisted systems to enhance remedy selection and case analysis. With a strong commitment to ethical practice and lifelong learning, Professor Dr. Rafat Hashmi continues to guide, inspire, and elevate the standards of homeopathic education and patient care.